Imagine a story whispered from your great-grandmother to your grandmother, then to your mother, and finally to you. A tale that has traveled through time, changing slightly with each telling, yet carrying the same essential truth. This is the magic of oral history, a living thread connecting generations. These are not just bedtime stories or simple folklore. Oral traditions form the very backbone of how nations understand themselves, how communities remember their triumphs and tragedies, and how cultural identity is woven into the fabric of daily life. In a world increasingly dominated by written documents, official records, and digital archives, the spoken word retains a unique power, a deeply human, emotional resonance that printed text often lacks. Why is it that some of the most enduring narratives, the ones that truly shape who we are passed down through speech and memory rather than pen and paper? Think about the stories you heard as a child, the family legends shared at holiday gatherings, or the local tales that define your hometown. These accounts do more than entertain. They instruct, they warn, they comfort, and most importantly, they unite. They offer perspectives often missing from history books, giving voice to everyday people, marginalized groups, and those whose experiences might otherwise be forgotten. Oral histories challenge the singular, official version of events, inviting us into a richer, more nuanced understanding of our shared past. This video is an invitation to explore that profound intersection where storytelling meets history, where voice and memory collaborate to shape national identity. We'll journey across cultures and centuries, from ancient griots in West Africa to modern digital storytellers, uncovering how these spoken narratives preserve heritage, foster resilience, and even heal divided societies. You'll discover why these voices from the past are not relics but active, dynamic forces in our present, and why they matter more today than ever before. So settle in, open your mind, and get ready to see history not as a static record, but as a living, breathing conversation that continues to define who we are. So what exactly are we talking about when we say oral histories? At its heart, an oral history is a spoken account of an event, a tradition, or a personal experience that is passed from one person to another, and then down through the generations. Think of it as a living library, but instead of books on a shelf, the information is held in human memory and shared through conversation, storytelling, and performance. These aren't just the grand, sweeping myths about how the world began, though those are certainly a part of it. They are also the intimate family stories, the tale of how your great-grandparents met, the memory of a childhood home, the recipe for a secret sauce that is explained, not written down. They encompass community legends about a local landmark, songs that recount a historical battle, and the shared anecdotes that define a workplace culture. Unlike a written document which is fixed the moment the ink dries, an oral history is wonderfully dynamic. It breathes and changes with each telling. The storyteller might emphasize a different detail to suit a new audience, or the listener might interpret a phrase in a unique way, adding their own slight nuance when they eventually become the storyteller themselves. This fluidity means these narratives are never frozen in time. They are constantly refined and recontextualized, reflecting the evolving perspectives and values of the people who carry them. For a long time, Western academia dismissed these traditions as unreliable folklore, more fit for entertainment than serious historical study. But pioneering scholars like Jan Vansener revolutionized this view, arguing passionately that oral traditions are not only valid historical sources, but are often the only window we have into understanding societies that did not rely on written records. The key to appreciating them lies in understanding their unique structure and purpose. They are not meant to be a perfect fact-by-fact transcript of an event. Instead, they capture the emotional truth, the cultural values, and the collective wisdom of a community. A written law might tell you the punishment for a crime, but an oral story about someone who committed that crime will teach you about the shame it brought upon their family, the community's grief, and the moral lesson that everyone is meant to learn from it. It is this rich, multi-layered texture that makes oral histories so indispensable. They are the foundational pillars upon which community identity is built, providing a sense of shared past, shared values, and a shared destiny. This deeper understanding of what they are, not as simple stories, but as complex, living repositories of culture, sets the stage for us to see their truly profound impact on the grand scale of national memory and identity. To understand just how deeply oral traditions are woven into the very fabric of humanity, we have to travel back in time thousands of years before the first libraries, before the printing press, before a single word was ever written down. In these earliest human societies, the spoken word was everything. It was the sole vessel for all accumulated knowledge, the only way to preserve culture, history, and identity across generations. Imagine a world without books, without archives, without the internet. In that world, the community's memory lived in the minds and voices of its people, and the most crucial role belonged to the storytellers. These weren't just casual raconteurs. They were highly skilled, respected professionals, the living hard drives of their time. In West Africa, they were known as griots, custodians of history who could recite the genealogies of great families and the chronicles of empires. In Celtic Europe, bards performed epic poems that celebrated heroes and encoded tribal laws. In countless indigenous cultures, elders held the sacred duty of holding the stories that connected their people to the land and to their ancestors. The sheer volume of information these individuals could memorize is staggering to us today. They didn't just remember facts, they preserved intricate narratives, sometimes taking days to perform in full. How did they manage such an incredible feat of memory? The answer lies in the art of performance. These oral traditions were not monotonous recitations. They were dynamic, multisensory experiences. Storytellers used rhythm, rhyme, and melody, turning history into song. They incorporated repetition of key phrases, a natural mnemonic device that helped both the teller and the listener lock the story into memory. They used physical gestures, dance, and even audience participation, transforming a historical account into a communal event. This performative aspect made the stories engaging, memorable, and emotionally resonant. They weren't just learning about their history, they were feeling it, experiencing it together as a community. This is how some of the world's most foundational stories survived for millennia before ever being written down. The epic poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which we now think of as classic texts, were originally vibrant oral performances. For centuries, these stories of the Trojan War and Odysseus's long journey home were sung by traveling bards across ancient Greece. They weren't fixed, static works. Each performance was slightly unique, adapted for its audience, yet they consistently reinforced the values, heroes, and ideals that came to define Greek culture. On a different continent for over 60,000 years, Aboriginal Australians have maintained the world's oldest continuous culture through the dreamtime, or dreaming. These are not myths in the way Western culture might think of them. They are complex oral narratives that encompass creation stories, spiritual beliefs, moral codes, and practical laws for living in balance with the land. Every rock formation, river, and animal has a story within the dreaming, embedding the landscape itself with meaning and memory. This profound connection, maintained entirely through oral tradition, illustrates how these stories are a map of existence, a guide for living, and a title deed to country all at once. The resilience and adaptability of these ancient practices are a testament to their fundamental importance in human development. They were not a primitive precursor to writing. They were a sophisticated, robust, and incredibly effective technology for preserving and transmitting the most vital information a society possesses. Recognizing these deep, ancient roots allows us to appreciate why oral histories are not a thing of the past. That same powerful impulse to share our story, to connect with our community through narrative, is as alive today as it was around those ancient fires. Now let's place these two forms of history side by side. On one hand, you have the written record, the official document, the government ledger, the published academic text. It feels permanent, authoritative, and concrete. We tend to grant it immense power because it's physically there, something we can hold and point to. It carries the weight of an institution behind it, but that authority can be a double-edged sword. For much of history, the ability to create and keep written records was concentrated in the hands of the powerful, the rulers, the colonizers, the wealthy elites. Their perspective, their priorities, and their biases are literally written into the official story. A ship's log might meticulously record the number of enslaved people transported as cargo, treating them as inventory, but it will never capture the gut-wrenching fear of a mother whispering a lullaby to her child in the darkness of the hold. This is where oral history steps in, not to replace the written word, but to stand beside it and say, "Wait, there's more to this story." Oral histories give us the subjective, lived experience. They are built from memory and emotion, from the senses and the soul. They capture the smell of the air on a pivotal day, the unspoken tension in a room, the personal cost of a historical event that a formal report would never think to mention. They are the essential human counterpoint to the cold, hard data. This dynamic creates a powerful dialogue between the two forms. Official records might tell us the date a law was passed, but oral histories reveal how that law actually changed the daily lives of ordinary people, for better or for worse. They are frequently the only way we hear from those who were systematically excluded from the official narrative: the enslaved, the indigenous, the working poor, the dissidents. Consider the immense value of projects that recorded the testimonies of the last surviving enslaved Africans in the United States in the 1930s. While plantation records might list names, ages, and prices, these oral interviews conveyed the visceral terror of family separation, the brutal reality of forced labor, and the profound strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable cruelty. They provide a depth of understanding that sanitized legal and economic documents simply cannot. However, it's also true that the very strength of oral history, its fluid, personal nature, can also be seen as a vulnerability. Memories can fade or become conflated over time. A storyteller might unconsciously emphasize certain details and minimize others based on their present-day context or audience. The story evolves with each telling. This isn't necessarily a weakness, it's a characteristic. It shows how communities continually reinterpret their past to make sense of their present. The key for historians is not to dismiss oral accounts for their fluidity, but to understand the cultural and personal reasons behind those changes. The goal isn't to crown one form of history as the ultimate truth. Instead, the richest, most democratic understanding of our past emerges from this very interplay. We use the written record to anchor events in time and place, and we use oral histories to fill those events with meaning, emotion, and the voices of the many, not just the few. Together, they correct each other, they challenge each other, and they give us a far more complete and humane picture of who we are and where we come from. Perhaps the most immediate and tangible gift that oral histories provide is their role as guardians of cultural heritage. Think of all the elements that make a culture unique, not the monuments or artifacts in a museum, but the living, breathing practices that define a community's way of life. These are the songs sung at celebrations, the recipes that require a pinch of this and a handful of that, passed down with a story, the intricate steps of a traditional dance, the knowledge of which plants can heal and which stars to follow for navigation. This intangible cultural heritage is incredibly fragile. It exists only as long as there are people to remember it, practice it, and pass it on. Without a continuous chain of storytellers and listeners, this priceless knowledge can vanish in a single generation. Oral traditions are the vital link in that chain, acting as living, breathing repositories for this wealth of information. They are the dynamic libraries where this intangible heritage is stored, not on dusty shelves, but in the collective memory of the people. Consider the profound connection between language and oral history. For many indigenous and minority cultures around the world, their native language is the primary vessel for their entire worldview. The words, the grammar, the very structure of the language contains concepts, relationships to the natural world, and philosophical ideas that simply do not exist in other tongues. When a language dies, an entire way of seeing and understanding the universe fades with it. Oral histories are a powerful force in the fight against this linguistic erosion. The Maori of New Zealand offer a powerful example of this. For decades, the Maori language, Te Reo, was suppressed, its use actively discouraged in schools and public life. What kept it alive during this period of immense pressure? It was the determined oral transmission within families and communities. Elders whispered it to children, stories were told, songs were sung. The famous haka, often misunderstood as merely a war dance, is in fact a complex oral tradition, a rhythmic declaration of ancestry, history, and identity, performed with precise choreography and powerful vocalization. Each performance is an act of cultural preservation, a defiant proclamation that we are still here and our stories will not be silenced. This is not just about remembering words, it is about actively sustaining a cultural heartbeat. The value of this preservation is recognized on a global scale. The United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, maintains lists of intangible cultural heritage in need of urgent safeguarding. This isn't a symbolic gesture. It's a critical acknowledgement that the diversity of human expression is as vital to protect as any endangered species or ancient ruin. UNESCO understands that these oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, and traditional crafts are essential to maintaining cultural diversity in the face of growing globalization. When we lose a unique oral history, we don't just lose a story, we lose a unique solution to the human experience, a different way of living with each other and with our planet. The loss leads to a flattening of global culture, a homogenization where local distinctiveness is replaced by a more generic, commercialized identity. This preservation is about so much more than nostalgia for the past. It is about actively sustaining cultural vitality for the future. The traditional knowledge held within oral histories often contains incredible practical wisdom that is suddenly relevant again. Indigenous oral histories frequently detail sophisticated land management practices, sustainable agricultural techniques, and a deep understanding of local ecosystems developed over millennia. In an era confronting climate change and environmental degradation, this orally preserved knowledge is no longer just a cultural artifact. It is a crucial resource for building a more resilient future. Preserving these narratives is an active, forward-looking endeavor. It ensures that future generations have access to the full tapestry of human knowledge and creativity, allowing them to draw from the deep wells of the past to meet the challenges of tomorrow. This proactive role showcases oral histories not as relics in a museum case, but as living, essential tools for cultural survival and continued flourishing. So if oral histories preserve the cultural ingredients, then the process of forming collective memory is where those ingredients are combined and baked into the very identity of a nation. Collective memory isn't just the sum of what everyone remembers individually. It's something far more powerful and cohesive. It's the shared understanding of the past that a group develops together, the common story that members of a community tell themselves about who they are and where they came from. Think of it as a nation's internal autobiography, constantly being written and rewritten. And while monuments, textbooks, and national holidays all contribute to this, the most intimate and pervasive thread weaving this tapestry is oral history. These spoken stories, passed across kitchen tables and in community gatherings, are the primary tools we use to construct a sense of continuity and belonging, linking one individual to another and to the generations that came before. This process often revolves around amplifying certain core values that a community holds dear, such as resilience in the face of adversity, unity against a common threat, or the nobility of sacrifice. The stories are curated, perhaps unconsciously, to highlight these themes, effectively turning historical events into powerful moral and emotional lessons for the present. A profound example of this can be found in Ireland and its relationship to the Great Famine of the 1840s. The official historical record tells us about potato blight, export policies, and mortality rates. But the oral history, the stories that seeped into the national psyche, tells a much deeper, more human story. For generations, Irish families have passed down accounts of the utter devastation, the hunger that gnawed at bellies, the heartbreak of abandoned homes, the desperate journey on what became known as coffin ships headed for America. These aren't just tales of tragedy, they are stories of resistance, of a people pushed to the brink by outside forces, who endured and ultimately scattered across the globe yet fiercely held onto their identity. This orally transmitted memory forged a national identity deeply rooted in themes of suffering, resilience, and a lingering skepticism of external authority. It became a unifying narrative, a shared pain that every Irish person, whether at home or in the diaspora, felt connected to. This memory is then continually reinforced and made tangible through family stories, songs of lament and rebellion, poetry, and annual public commemorations, ensuring that each new generation feels the emotional weight of that history. The French sociologist Maurice Halbwach was a pioneer in developing this concept of collective memory. He argued that all memory, even our most personal recollections, is socially constructed. We remember not in isolation, but within a framework provided by our families, our communities, and our societies. These groups determine what is important to remember, how it should be remembered, and what lessons should be drawn from it. Oral histories are the lifeblood of this process. They are the mechanism by which a group says, "This event defined us, this struggle made us who we are." This value is what we hold sacred. It's through the constant retelling and listening that individuals internalize the group's narrative, aligning their personal understanding of the past with the collective one. This doesn't mean the memory is false, it means it is purposeful. It serves to strengthen social bonds, create solidarity, and provide a stable identity for the group over time. We can see this powerful molding effect in communities everywhere. The stories a town tells about its founding, the tales a military unit recounts about its hardest-won battle, the narratives a family shares about an ancestor's immigration. all of these oral traditions actively shape the identity of that particular group. They answer the fundamental questions of who are we and what do we stand for by providing a shared origin story and a set of shared experiences. This is why the loss of oral history can feel so catastrophic to a community. It's not just losing stories, it's losing the very glue that holds their collective identity together. It's the difference between having a family tree with names and dates versus having the rich, detailed stories about each person, their loves, their failures, their quirks, and their triumphs. One gives you a structure, but the other gives you a soul. Through this lens, we see that oral traditions are far from passive reflections of the past. They are active, dynamic agents in the present, continually molding and remolding the memories that, in turn, define and unite communities across time. But perhaps one of the most transformative powers of oral history lies in its unique ability to challenge, to question, and to correct the official record. For centuries, history has been written by the victors, the powerful, the ones who controlled the printing presses and the state archives. This has created a dominant narrative, a single story that often glorifies certain actions while silencing others. Oral history acts as a powerful corrective to this, serving as a vital counter-narrative that drags suppressed truths out of the shadows and into the light. It gives a microphone to those who are deliberately excluded from the official accounts, the colonized, the oppressed, the dissidents, the everyday people who lived through the consequences of decisions made in faraway halls of power. These spoken testimonies don't just add a footnote to history, they often rewrite entire chapters, revealing the human cost that cold, bureaucratic documents deliberately ignore or actively distort. We can find no more powerful example of this than in South Africa's journey out of the darkness of apartheid. For decades, the white minority government maintained a brutal system of racial segregation and oppression, enforcing it through law, violence, and a tightly controlled narrative that justified its actions. The official records might show legislation and policy, but they concealed the terror, the trauma, and the shattered lives. When apartheid finally fell, the new nation faced an immense challenge: how to confront this horrific past without being torn apart by vengeance. The solution was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. At its heart, this was an unprecedented national project in oral history. For the first time on a public stage, thousands of victims were invited to step forward and simply tell their stories. They spoke of loved ones who had disappeared, of torture, of humiliation, and of profound loss. And in a stunning act, perpetrators were also given a platform to confess their actions in exchange for amnesty. The airwaves were filled with these raw, unscripted, oral accounts. The process was messy, emotionally devastating, and deeply controversial, but it was undeniably powerful. The official, sanitized government narrative of apartheid crumbled under the weight of these personal truths. The Commission understood that for national healing to begin, the full, ugly story had to be heard and acknowledged. It was through this collective act of speaking and listening that a new, more honest national memory began to form, one that could hopefully serve as a foundation for a shared future. This pattern of oral history contesting colonial narratives is a global phenomenon, particularly potent in the Americas. For over 500 years, the history of the continent has been largely told from the perspective of the European explorers and settlers, a story of discovery, manifest destiny, and progress. This narrative systematically marginalized indigenous peoples, often portraying them as primitive obstacles to be overcome or vanished relics of the past. But native communities have always held their own histories, meticulously preserved and passed down through countless generations. These oral traditions tell a radically different story, one of sophisticated civilizations, deep spiritual connection to the land, and the catastrophic violence and cultural rupture brought by colonization. When an Indigenous elder shares a creation story about how their people emerged into this world, it directly challenges the textbook notion that history began with the arrival of Columbus. When they recount through song and story the details of a treaty signing from their ancestral perspective, it exposes the betrayals and broken promises that official documents might gloss over. These are not myths, they are historical records that carry legal weight and are increasingly being recognized in courts and academic circles. By insisting on the validity of their oral histories, Indigenous peoples are not just preserving their culture, they are engaged in an act of intellectual and political sovereignty, forcefully reclaiming their rightful place in the historical narrative and demanding a more complete and truthful account of the past. This subversive, democratizing power is what makes oral history so essential to a healthy society. It acts as a check on power, ensuring that the single story does not become the only story. By amplifying a chorus of diverse voices from the margins, it complicates our understanding of the past, revealing it to be a multifaceted tapestry of experiences rather than a simple, clean timeline of events. This doesn't create division, rather, it fosters a more inclusive and accurate collective memory, one that can accommodate complexity and contradiction. It encourages all of us to engage in critical reflection, to ask not just what happened, but whose story is being told and whose story is being left out. In doing so, oral histories don't just reshape our understanding of the past, they actively reshape our national consciousness, pushing us toward a future that is more honest, more empathetic, and more just. Beyond their power to challenge authority and unite communities, oral histories serve another profound purpose, one that operates on the most fundamental level of human interaction. They are the primary vehicle for passing down a society's moral and ethical code. Long before the invention of written laws or formal schools, it was through stories that communities taught each new generation how to be good people, how to treat one another, and what it meant to be a valued member of the group. These narratives are far more than simple entertainment. They are sophisticated teaching tools, carefully crafted over generations to embed essential values directly into the cultural DNA. Through the thrilling adventures of heroes, the cautionary tales of villains, and the relatable struggles of everyday people, abstract concepts like courage, honesty, compassion, and responsibility are brought to life in a way that is memorable, impactful, and deeply personal. Consider the timeless tradition of the fable, a form of oral storytelling perfected across cultures, but perhaps most famously associated with West Africa. Here, the animal fable is a masterclass in ethical instruction. Characters like the clever spider Anansi, the powerful elephant, or the sly tortoise are not just whimsical creatures, they are archetypes representing human strengths and flaws. In one story, Anansi's greed might lead him into a trap, teaching listeners about the dangers of selfishness. In another, the cooperation of a group of small animals might allow them to overcome a much larger predator, illustrating the undeniable strength found in unity and teamwork. The brilliance of this method lies in its subtlety and engagement. A child listening to a story about a trickster rabbit doesn't feel like they're being lectured on morality. They are simply captivated by the narrative. Yet, without even realizing it, they are internalizing powerful lessons about the consequences of actions, the importance of wit over brute force, and the value of keeping one's promises. These stories provide a safe, imaginative space to explore complex social situations and their outcomes, equipping young minds with a moral framework they can draw upon throughout their lives. This transmission of values is crucial for maintaining social cohesion. A shared set of ethical principles acts as a social glue, creating a common understanding of right and wrong that allows a community to function with trust and mutual respect. When everyone knows the story of the leader who sacrificed his own comfort for his people, the archetype of selfless leadership becomes a cultural expectation. When tales are told of the individual whose dishonesty led to their downfall, a powerful deterrent against deceit is established. These narratives create a collective conscience, a shared moral compass that guides behavior from within, often more effectively than any written law enforced from without. They answer not just the question of what happened, but the more critical question of what does this mean for how we should live. This role transforms oral historians and storytellers into more than just keepers of the past. They become the guardians of a community's soul. In many traditions, these figures are revered elders, griots, or shamans, entrusted with the sacred duty of shaping the character of the young. Their performances during rituals, festivals, and gatherings are not mere recitations but powerful reaffirmations of the community's core values. The rhythmic cadence of the telling, the emotional intonation, and the participatory nature of the event all serve to heighten the impact of the lesson, ensuring it resonates on an emotional level and sticks in the memory far longer than a simple list of rules ever could. In this way, oral histories do more than just describe a culture's identity. They actively perpetuate and protect it, ensuring that the heart of the community, its shared sense of ethics and purpose, continues to beat strongly in the chest of each new generation. This incredible ability to adapt and evolve is perhaps one of the most defining features of oral histories, setting them apart from any other form of historical record. Unlike a book that is printed and forever fixed, or a stone inscription that weathers but does not change, an oral tradition is a living, breathing entity. It grows and shifts with the people who carry it, ensuring it never becomes a dusty relic but remains a vibrant, relevant part of contemporary life. Think of it like a river. The water is always moving, always flowing, and the riverbed itself may gradually change course over centuries, but it is still the same river, connected from its source to its mouth. The core essence, the fundamental truth or lesson of the story, remains constant, but the specific details, the characters, the settings, the metaphors, can be subtly refined by each generation of storytellers. This isn't seen as a corruption of the original. It's a sign of the story's health and continued importance. A skilled storyteller is not a mere recitation machine. They are an interpreter, a translator for their specific audience. They might adjust a tale to comment on a current social issue, to incorporate a recently learned lesson, or to use imagery and language that will resonate more deeply with younger listeners who live in a very different world than their ancestors. This process keeps the narrative alive and meaningful, preventing it from becoming a hollow ritual that is performed without understanding. We can see this powerful adaptability addressing some of the most pressing modern challenges. For generations, many Native American communities have maintained intricate oral histories that detail their sacred responsibility as stewards of the land. These stories encode profound ecological knowledge, the migration patterns of animals, the medicinal properties of plants, the signs of seasonal change, and a philosophical understanding of humanity's place within, not above, the natural world. For a long time, these narratives were shared primarily within the community as a way of perpetuating cultural values. But in the face of modern environmental crises like climate change and widespread pollution, these same oral histories are being adapted for a new purpose. Tribal elders and knowledge keepers are now sharing these stories with a wider audience, including scientists, policymakers, and environmental activists. They are framing their ancient narratives not just as cultural artifacts, but as vital, time-tested blueprints for sustainable living and ecological balance. The core theme of respect for the earth remains unchanged, but the application of that theme has evolved to meet an urgent, contemporary need. The story becomes a tool for advocacy, a bridge between traditional wisdom and modern science, demonstrating its incredible resilience and ongoing significance. This very strength, however, introduces a complex and fascinating tension between preservation and evolution. If a story is constantly changing, at what point does it cease to be the same story? How do we distinguish between a respectful adaptation and a loss of authenticity? These are questions that communities and scholars grapple with deeply. There is a legitimate concern that as stories are simplified for new audiences or blended with outside influences, some of the original nuance, specific cultural context, or sacred meaning could be diluted or lost entirely. This is why the role of the trained storyteller is so crucial in many traditions. They are the guardians of the narrative's integrity, entrusted with knowing the story's heart so well that they can adapt its outer shell without damaging its soul. The goal is not to freeze the story in a single, perfect form, but to manage its evolution with intention and respect, ensuring that its transformative power continues while its essential truth is honored. Understanding this dynamic, ever-changing nature is key to truly appreciating the resilience of oral histories. Their power doesn't lie in being an unchanging monument to the past, but in being a living conversation between the past, present, and future. This fluidity is what allows a story first told centuries ago around a fire to still have the power to stir the heart of a teenager listening on their smartphone today. It is this breathtaking capacity for evolution that has allowed oral traditions to survive colonization, globalization, and technological revolution, continually offering themselves as responsive, indispensable tools for helping us understand who we are and who we aspire to be. To truly grasp the profound bond between oral history and cultural survival, we must turn our attention to the world's indigenous cultures, where this connection is not a historical footnote but a living, breathing reality. For countless indigenous communities, from the rainforests of the Amazon to the Arctic tundra, oral traditions are far more than stories. They are the very lifeblood of identity, the legal deed to their ancestral lands, and the operating manual for their entire way of being. These narratives form a complete cosmological framework, seamlessly weaving together creation stories that explain the universe's origins, historical accounts of migration and settlement, spiritual beliefs that connect every rock and river to the divine, and practical laws that govern social order and environmental stewardship. This intricate tapestry of knowledge is held not in books or databases, but in the collective memory of the people, passed meticulously from elder to youth through the sacred act of storytelling. The continuity of the culture itself depends on the unbroken strength of this oral chain. Consider the profound depth of the Aboriginal Australian concept of the dreamtime, or what many groups call the dreaming. This is perhaps one of the most sophisticated and enduring oral tradition systems on Earth, maintained for over 60,000 years. To label the dreaming as mere mythology is a profound misunderstanding. It is, in fact, a complex and holistic world, where the spiritual, natural, and human realms are inextricably linked. Every feature of the vast Australian landscape, every mountain range, every waterhole, every unique rock formation, is explained by the journeys and actions of ancestral creator beings during the dreamtime. These narratives, passed down through song, dance, and art, are not just about a remote past. They are a continuous present, a living force that dictates kinship structures, ethical behavior, ritual practices, and land management. A songline is a perfect example of this. It is an oral map sung across hundreds of miles that describes the path of an ancestral being. By singing the song in the correct sequence, individuals could navigate the continent, knowing exactly where to find water, food, and shelter. This oral history is therefore both a spiritual guide and a practical tool for survival, deeply embedding the people's identity within the land itself and forming the undeniable foundation for their ongoing struggle for land rights and sovereignty. On the other side of the globe, the Navajo or Diné people of North America offer another powerful testament to the resilience encoded in oral history. Their elaborate creation stories, such as the narrative of emerging from previous worlds into the glittering world, define their understanding of their place in the universe and their relationship with all living things. Woven within these epic accounts is a vast body of ecological knowledge. Oral traditions detail the properties of hundreds of plants for medicinal and ceremonial use, the behaviors of animals, and sustainable agricultural practices perfected over centuries in the high desert. This knowledge allowed the Diné to not only survive but to thrive in a challenging environment. Their history is also one of immense resilience, and this too is preserved orally. Stories of the Long Walk, the forced relocation and internment by the U.S. government in the 1860s, are not found in most history books with the same visceral detail. But within Navajo families, these accounts of suffering, endurance, and ultimate return to their homeland are told and retold. These narratives are not tales of victimhood. They are chronicles of survival that reinforce a collective identity built on perseverance, adaptability, and an unbreakable connection to Diné Bikaya, the Navajo homeland. The threat to these oral traditions, therefore, is not merely a threat to cultural heritage. It is an existential threat to the very identity and survival of these communities. Colonization, forced assimilation policies, the establishment of residential schools designed to kill the Indian, save the man, and the relentless pressures of modernization have all served to severely weaken the intergenerational transmission of these stories. When an elder passes away without having the opportunity to pass on their knowledge, it is like a library burning down. A unique way of seeing the world, a language, and a set of answers to fundamental human questions can disappear in a single generation. This loss severs the community from its past, disorients it in the present, and undermines its foundation for the future. In response, incredibly vital revitalization efforts are underway, often led by Indigenous communities themselves who are reclaiming their narrative sovereignty. Digital technology has become a surprising ally. Projects are using audio and video recordings to create digital archives of elders telling stories in their native languages, ensuring their pronunciation, emotion, and context are preserved with fidelity. Communities are launching storytelling workshops where youth are trained in the old ways, not just to memorize stories, but to understand their deeper meanings and responsibilities as the next generation of knowledge keepers. Bilingual books and animated films based on oral traditions are being created to engage children. These efforts are not about freezing these histories in time, but about strengthening the living chain of transmission, ensuring these unique worldviews not only survive but continue to evolve and guide their people. This powerful case study illuminates the ultimate truth that for Indigenous cultures, oral history is not a separate subject to be studied. It is the bedrock of existence, the breath of the ancestors, and the blueprint for the future, all held within the power of the spoken word. Nowhere is the raw, transformative power of the spoken word more evident than in the painful, delicate process of rebuilding a society after the horrors of war or civil conflict. When the guns fall silent and the rubble is cleared, the deepest wounds remain the psychological scars of trauma, the festering resentment between former enemies, and the shattered trust that makes a shared future seem impossible. Official peace treaties and political agreements can stop the violence on paper, but they cannot, on their own, heal a nation's soul. This is the profound space where oral history steps in, not as a mere historical exercise, but as a vital, active agent of healing and reconciliation. In the aftermath of mass violence, the act of telling one's story, and just as importantly, the act of being truly heard, becomes a critical form of first aid for the human spirit. It is a process that allows individuals to process unspeakable trauma, to have their suffering formally acknowledged, and to begin the slow, painful work of building a new, shared understanding of a fractured past. This isn't about creating a single, agreed-upon version of history. It's about creating a space where multiple, conflicting truths can coexist and be validated, which is the essential first step toward any genuine and lasting peace. The case of Rwanda following the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi stands as one of the most powerful and harrowing examples of this process in action. In the span of just 100 days, over 800,000 people were brutally murdered, often by their own neighbors, friends, or even family members. The scale of the atrocity was so vast that the traditional justice system was completely overwhelmed. There were simply too many perpetrators to ever prosecute in conventional courts. The country faced an impossible dilemma: how to achieve justice and foster reconciliation without tearing the social fabric apart all over again. The solution Rwanda turned to was deeply rooted in its own pre-colonial traditions, a community-based justice system called gacaca. These were not held in distant courtrooms, but right in the villages where the crimes had occurred. The entire community would gather, and in these intensely emotional and public forums, perpetrators were given a platform to confess their crimes in detail in exchange for the possibility of a reduced sentence. But more importantly, survivors and families of victims were given the sacred opportunity to speak. They stood and shared their stories, the specific, personal, agonizing details of how their loved ones were killed, the terror they felt, the loss that now defined their lives. For many, this was the first time they had ever learned the exact fate of a missing family member. The oral testimonies given in these thousands of gacaca courts were not just about establishing facts for a legal judgment. They were about creating a collective, public record of the truth. They forced a society to stare directly into the abyss of what it had done, to hear the human cost from the mouths of those who had paid it. This incredibly painful and courageous process was instrumental in allowing Rwanda to begin reshaping its national identity away from the ethnic divisions of Hutu and Tutsi that had fueled the genocide, and toward a new, shared identity built on a common, however horrific, memory and a collective desire for a unified future. A similar, though differently structured, reliance on oral testimony has been crucial in the long journey toward peace in Northern Ireland after decades of sectarian violence known as the Troubles. For 30 years, conflict between predominantly Protestant Unionists who wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom and predominantly Catholic nationalists who sought a united Ireland resulted in thousands of deaths and a society deeply segregated by fear and mistrust. The 1998 Good Friday Agreement brought a formal end to the violence, but it could not automatically end the generations of ingrained prejudice and competing narratives. Here, oral history projects undertaken by universities, community groups, and organizations like the Belfast-based Healing Through Remembering have played a vital role in filling the gaps left by politics. These projects have meticulously recorded the personal stories of individuals from all sides of the conflict: former combatants, security force members, emergency responders, and countless civilians who were simply caught in the crossfire. By creating a vast, nuanced archive of these lived experiences, these initiatives do something that official histories often fail to do. They capture the profound complexity and human contradiction of the conflict. A story from a British soldier might sit alongside an account from an Irish Republican Army volunteer, and a narrative from a Protestant mother who lost a son might be next to that of a Catholic father who suffered the same loss. Listening to these stories does not necessarily lead to agreement on the political causes of the Troubles, but it almost invariably fosters something equally important: empathy. It becomes much harder to dismiss the other side as a monolithic enemy when you have heard the trembling voice of a grandmother describing her fear, or the regret in a former fighter's tone as he reflects on his youth. These oral histories help to complicate the simplistic us versus them narratives that perpetuate conflict, replacing them with a more textured and humane collective memory that acknowledges the universal experiences of loss, fear, and the desire for peace that transcends political allegiance. What makes this process so transformative, whether in the formal setting of a Gakaka court or the intimate setting of a recorded interview, is its power to humanize. In the heat of conflict, adversaries are systematically dehumanized. They are reduced to labels, to propaganda, to faceless representatives of an opposing ideology. Oral history systematically reverses this process when a perpetrator confesses not just to a crime, but to the specific human detail of it, perhaps remembering the fear in a victim's eyes or the weather on that day. They are, in a terrible way, reinstating their victim's humanity. And when a victim chooses to speak, to look their perpetrator in the eye and recount their pain, they are reclaiming their own agency and humanity in the face of those who tried to erase it. This exchange, as agonizing as it is, forms the bedrock of reconciliation. It allows a society to build a new national identity, not on a foundation of forgotten or suppressed pain, but on a conscious, shared acknowledgement of a terrible past and a mutual commitment to never let it happen again. The stories become a permanent part of the national conscience, a moral compass ensuring that the hard lessons of history are not forgotten, but are instead woven directly into the fabric of a society's understanding of itself, guiding it toward a more peaceful and inclusive future. Yet while the stories themselves are the treasure, it is the master storytellers who are the irreplaceable locksmiths, the dedicated guardians of the keys to the past. In many cultures around the world, this sacred duty of preservation and transmission wasn't a casual hobby for anyone. It was a highly specialized, deeply respected profession, often passed down through specific family lineages. These individuals were the human hard drives of their communities, the living, breathing libraries entrusted with safeguarding the entire collective memory. And perhaps no figure embodies this role more completely or famously than the griot from West Africa. To call a griot simply a storyteller is a dramatic understatement. They were, and in many places still are, the ultimate multi-hyphenates of cultural preservation. They were historians, genealogists, musicians, poets, praise singers, advisors to rulers, and masters of ceremony. Their knowledge was encyclopedic. A griot could recite the history of a kingdom, tracing the lineage of a ruling family back for centuries. They could tell you the story behind every significant battle, every peace treaty, every drought, and every triumph. But they didn't just recite dry facts and dates. They performed this history. They would accompany their narratives with music from instruments like the kora, a beautiful 21-string harp lute, using rhythm and melody to enhance the emotional power of the tale. Their poetic skills allowed them to turn a historical event into a captivating epic, filled with metaphor and imagery that made the past feel immediate and vital. This multi-sensory approach wasn't just for entertainment. It was a sophisticated memory technology. The music, the rhyme, the rhythm, they all served as mnemonic devices, helping both the griot and the audience lock the intricate details into their minds for years to come. The social role of the griot extended far beyond performance. They were integral to the very structure of society. At a wedding, a griot would be there to extol the virtues of the families being united, weaving their histories together. At a naming ceremony, they would connect the newborn to their ancestors through song and story. They were advisors to kings and chiefs, not only because they knew the history, but because they understood the patterns within it, the consequences of past decisions, the lessons from old conflicts. Their words could counsel a leader toward peace or inspire warriors before a battle. This placed them in a position of immense respect and soft authority. They were the keepers of the stories that defined who the people were, and that knowledge granted them a unique social power. They were both revered and, at times, slightly feared, for they held the power to shape reputation and legacy through their praise songs or their critiques. Their presence was essential for maintaining social cohesion, reinforcing shared values, and ensuring that every generation understood their place within the long, unbroken chain of their community's existence. This model of the specialized oral historian is a global phenomenon, even if the titles change. In Scotland and Ireland, there were the Sínchai, esteemed tradition bearers who held the history, folklore, and genealogy of their people. Among the Native American nations of the Pacific Northwest, master storytellers are entrusted with specific, sacred stories that can only be told at certain times of the year and in specific ways. In India, the Panvani performers sing the stories of the epic Mahabharata. These roles were pillars of cultural stability. However, the relentless march of modernity, with its emphasis on written records, formal education, and digital media, has placed these ancient professions in serious jeopardy. The economic models that once supported griots and storytellers have often faded, and the younger generation, drawn to cities and new careers, may not have the years of apprenticeship required to learn the vast repertoires. This decline represents more than just the loss of a job title. It risks severing a vital link in the chain of cultural transmission, potentially causing entire swaths of history and identity to vanish into silence. Recognizing this existential threat, there are passionate and innovative efforts underway around the world to train new generations of these crucial figures. Cultural organizations, often in partnership with elder knowledge keepers, are establishing formal schools and workshops where young people can apprentice in the old arts. They learn not just the stories and songs, but the correct protocols, the languages, and the musical techniques. Technology, once seen as a threat, is now being harnessed as a powerful ally. Aspiring griots might use digital audio recorders to capture an elder's telling with perfect fidelity, creating a reference library to supplement their memory. Communities are leveraging YouTube and social media to share performances with a global diaspora, generating interest and a new sense of value around these traditions. These efforts are about more than nostalgia. They are an active investment in cultural resilience. They acknowledge that while books and archives can preserve the words, it is the human heartbeat, the breath, the emotional inflections of a skilled storyteller that truly bring a history to life. Understanding this profound role deepens our appreciation for oral tradition, moving us beyond the abstract concept of story and into the tangible, human reality of its creation and care. It reminds us that behind every great collective memory stands a dedicated individual who has chosen to become the living voice of their ancestors, ensuring their whispers are never drowned out by the noise of the present. Now, let's consider how these deeply personal, community-sourced oral narratives coalesce into something much larger and more powerful: the foundational myths that entire nations build their identity upon. National mythology isn't about falsehoods, It's about the grand, overarching stories a nation tells itself about its origins, its core values, and its destiny. These are the epic tales that answer the fundamental questions: where did we come from? What do we stand for? What makes us unique? And more often than not, these colossal national myths have their humble, powerful beginnings not in a state archive, but in the vibrant, evolving tradition of oral history. It is the raw, emotional material of countless personal and communal stories that provides the essential fuel and legitimacy for these larger-than-life national narratives. The oral tradition acts as the fertile soil from which the mighty tree of national mythology grows, feeding it with a sense of authentic, lived experience that a purely invented story could never hope to achieve. Think about the foundational story of the United States, often referred to as the tale of the Founding Fathers. While we have their written words in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the powerful mythology that surrounds them, their almost superhuman wisdom, their unwavering dedication to liberty, their camaraderie in the face of adversity, was largely forged and perpetuated through oral and popular culture long before it was cemented in textbooks. Stories of George Washington's honesty, Benjamin Franklin's ingenuity, and the collective struggle for freedom were told and retold in town squares, around family hearths, and in public speeches. These oral accounts took the complex, often messy political realities of the Revolution and refined them into a cleaner, more inspiring narrative of righteous triumph and the birth of a new kind of nation. This myth, rooted in countless retellings, promotes the core values of freedom, democracy, and self-determination, providing a shared origin story that binds an incredibly diverse population together under a common ideal. For a different kind of example, we can look to the Nordic nation of Finland and its national epic, the Kalevala. In the 19th century, as Finland was seeking to assert its cultural identity and independence from Russian influence, a scholar named Elias Lönnrot didn't invent a new story from whole cloth. Instead, he traveled the countryside, meticulously collecting and recording ancient Finnish and Karelian folk poems, songs, and incantations that had been preserved through oral tradition for centuries. He wove these disparate oral pieces together into a single, cohesive epic poem. The Kalevala, with its heroes like the wise old Väinämöinen and the skilled smith Ilmarinen, gave Finland a mythological past to rival the Greek epics or the Norse sagas. It provided a deep, ancient wellspring of cultural legitimacy, a shared linguistic and poetic heritage that became a powerful rallying point for Finnish national consciousness. The values it promoted: resilience, connection to the natural world, and the power of wisdom and song were drawn directly from the oral stories of the people, making the myth feel authentically and uniquely Finnish. This is the unparalleled gift that oral histories bring to national mythology: emotional resonance and relatability. A dry, state-written history textbook can list facts and dates, but it cannot make a citizen feel a connection to their country. An oral story passed down through a family about an ancestor who fought in a revolution, or a community's shared legend about a local event that symbolizes national pride, adds a layer of personal, heartfelt truth. It transforms abstract concepts like liberty or resilience into something tangible: the smell of gunpowder at dawn, the determined look in a great-great-grandmother's eye as she endured a long winter. This process makes the national myth not just something to be learned, but something to be felt and internalized, ensuring its endurance across generations. The myth becomes intertwined with personal and family identity, making it incredibly robust. However, this very power demands a critical eye, for national myths have a dual nature. While they can inspire immense pride and powerful social cohesion, they can also oversimplify complex histories and actively silence contradictory narratives. The same American myth of the Founding Fathers, for instance, often sidesteps the uncomfortable paradox of men preaching liberty while enslaving other human beings. It has frequently excluded the perspectives and oral histories of enslaved Africans, Native Americans, and women, whose experiences tell a different, more complicated story about the nation's founding. The myth, in its quest for a clean, unifying narrative, can become a tool of exclusion, suggesting that only those who fit into its specific storyline are true patriots or legitimate members of the nation. The Finnish Kalevala, while a source of immense pride, also inevitably streamlined and curated a vast array of oral traditions, choosing some versions of stories over others and creating a canonical text that may not represent the full diversity of regional oral variants. Therefore, critically examining the relationship between oral history and national mythology is not an act of tearing down a nation's story. It is an act of maturing it. It involves listening to the chorus of voices within the oral tradition, not just the ones that have been amplified to support a single, dominant myth. It means acknowledging that a nation's history is not a single, smooth narrative but a collection of many, sometimes conflicting, stories. A healthy national identity can hold space for this complexity. It can celebrate the inspiring myth of the Founding Fathers while also holding the oral testimonies of those who suffered under the system they created, understanding that both are true and both are part of the American story. This doesn't weaken the nation, it strengthens it by fostering a more honest, inclusive, and resilient sense of self. Ultimately, this exploration reveals the immense power we vest in storytelling. It shows that the stories we choose to collectively tell about ourselves and those we choose to leave out are not passive reflections of who we are. They are active, powerful forces in constructing who we become. This deliberate dismantling of oral traditions was not a side effect of colonization. It was a central strategy of control. To conquer a land, you must first conquer the memory of its people. Colonizers understood this intimately. By imposing foreign languages through mandatory schooling, they severed the intimate link between a people's mother tongue and their stories. A language holds unique concepts, humor, and worldview that simply cannot be translated without loss. By introducing religions that labeled indigenous spiritual beliefs as pagan or savage, they systematically invalidated the very cosmological frameworks that gave oral narratives their meaning and power. The stories of ancestral beings connected to the land were recast as mere superstitions, to be replaced by the written texts and fixed doctrines of the colonizer. This was a profound psychological and cultural assault, designed to make people ashamed of their own heritage, to internalize the idea that their history was worthless because it was not written down in leather-bound books. Perhaps one of the most devastating and calculated examples of this erasure is found in the history of Canada's residential school system. For over a century, with the explicit goal to, as one Canadian official put it, kill the Indian in the child, Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families. In these institutions, run by churches and funded by the state, they were punished often brutally for speaking their native languages. Their traditional clothing and hair were cut off, their connection to their families and communities completely severed. This was a direct, targeted attack on the chain of oral transmission. The grandparents could not pass down stories to the grandchildren because the grandchildren were gone. The children, trapped in these schools, lost the opportunity to hear the stories that would have taught them who they were, where they came from, and their place in the world. The trauma of this cultural genocide did not end when the schools closed. It became intergenerational, creating a painful silence where there should have been a vibrant echo of voices. a rupture in the flow of memory that families are still working to heal today. This pattern of suppression was a global tool of empire. In Australia, similar policies of removing Aboriginal children from their families created the stolen generations, with the same goal of assimilation and cultural destruction. In Africa, European colonizers often elevated their own written languages of administration and education, while dismissing the rich oral traditions of griots and elders as primitive folklore. The message was consistent and clear: your way of knowing, your way of remembering is invalid. Real history, real knowledge looks like ours, and yet, against this overwhelming force, the human spirit and the stories it carries demonstrated breathtaking resilience. In the face of attempted erasure, the preservation of oral tradition became an act of quiet, powerful resistance. Parents and grandparents, risking punishment, whispered stories to their children in the dark. Communities held ceremonies in secret, far from the eyes of the colonizers, to keep the songs and rituals alive. Knowledge keepers hid the sacred meanings of stories within seemingly simple tales, ensuring their survival even if the surface was heard by outsiders. This was not merely about preserving the past, it was a defiant act of claiming a future, a way of insisting, we are still here and our stories will not die with us. This legacy of resistance has blossomed into the contemporary movement to decolonize history, a powerful effort to dismantle the singular, colonial narrative and center the voices that have been marginalized for centuries. This involves a profound shift in how we view historical authority. It means treating oral histories not as supplementary folklore to the real written record, but as primary sources of equal validity and often greater depth. Archaeologists, for instance, are increasingly partnering with indigenous communities, using their oral histories to locate ancient village sites, burial grounds, and places of significance that have been lost to written records. Land claims and treaty rights are being successfully argued in court based on the strength of oral testimony passed down through generations, a powerful legal recognition of this form of knowledge. Universities are establishing dedicated oral history archives and creating ethical protocols that ensure communities retain control over how their stories are recorded and used. Understanding the impact of colonization on oral traditions forces us to recognize that history is never neutral. The question of whose stories get told and how they are valued is deeply political. Oral histories are not just about the past, they are active instruments in ongoing struggles for cultural sovereignty, self-determination, and the right of a people to define themselves on their own terms. This historical context does not portray oral traditions as fragile relics easily destroyed. On the contrary, it highlights their incredible endurance, their ability to survive in the shadows, and their remarkable power to re-emerge stronger than ever as essential guides for healing, reclaiming identity, and building a future that honors the full, complex tapestry of the human experience. Just as the ancient griot might have adapted their storytelling to a new audience gathered around a communal fire, the digital age has provided a global, virtual fireside for the world's stories. Technology has fundamentally reshaped every aspect of the oral history tradition, from how we capture a voice to how we ensure it echoes for centuries to come. The humble tape recorder of the 20th century has been replaced by a stunning array of digital tools: high-fidelity microphones, smartphones with incredible recording capabilities, and vast cloud-based servers that can store millions of hours of audio and video. This technological leap has democratized the act of preservation in an unprecedented way. Where once the recording of history was the domain of academics and institutions with expensive equipment, today, anyone with a mobile phone can become an archivist, capturing the stories of their grandparents, their community, or themselves with a clarity that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. This ease of capture is matched by an even more revolutionary power: the ability to share these narratives with a global audience instantly. Digital platforms have become the new town squares and communal gathering places for storytelling. A podcast can amplify the voice of an Indigenous elder sharing a creation story to listeners in dozens of countries. A YouTube channel dedicated to oral histories from refugees can build empathy and understanding across vast cultural and geographic divides. Online archives like the University of Southern California's Show Foundation Visual History Archive or the British Library's extensive sound collections are making immense repositories of spoken testimony accessible to researchers, students, and the simply curious with just an internet connection. This global accessibility is particularly transformative for marginalized communities whose stories have been systematically excluded from mainstream historical narratives. For the first time, they can bypass traditional gatekeepers of publishing and media to share their lived experiences directly with the world, building their own archives and controlling their own narratives on their own terms. A beautiful and profoundly impactful example of this digital democratization is StoryCorps here in the United States. Founded in 2003, its model is elegantly simple yet deeply powerful. It provides the tools and the space for two people who know each other to have a recorded conversation. One person interviews the other, often a family member or loved one, and they discuss their lives, their relationships, and their memories. These 40-minute conversations are then preserved at the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, creating a growing people's history of the nation. Through its mobile recording booths and user-friendly app, StoryCorps has harnessed digital technology to collect and share over 600,000 interviews, each one a unique thread in the rich tapestry of American life. These stories, many of which are animated and shared online, have touched millions, reminding us of our shared humanity and the extraordinary stories that exist in what we might mistake for ordinary lives. This project perfectly illustrates how digital tools can be used not to replace the intimate, personal nature of oral history, but to amplify it, preserving these precious narratives for the long term and sharing their wisdom with a national audience. However, this new digital landscape is not without its own set of complex challenges and paradoxes. The very tools that promise perfect preservation also introduce questions about authenticity and alteration. In the analog era, a tape recording was a relatively fixed object. Editing required physical splicing. In the digital world, audio and video can be manipulated with sophisticated software, raising ethical questions about how much editing is acceptable before the integrity of the testimony is compromised. Does cleaning up background noise or removing a long pause change the emotional truth of the account? Furthermore, the process of curation, choosing which stories to highlight on a website or in a podcast series, creates a new kind of gatekeeping. While the potential for access is global, the reality is that only a tiny fraction of recorded stories will ever find a large audience, potentially creating a new digital canon that, despite its best intentions, might still overlook certain voices. There is also the risk of what some scholars call the digital sublime, the overwhelming volume of information available. With thousands of oral history interviews just a click away, there is a danger that individual stories could become lost in the sheer noise, their impact diluted in an endless sea of narratives. This leads us to the critical issue of the digital divide. The promise of a global storytelling network is predicated on one essential thing: access. And that access is not distributed equally. While many of us take high-speed internet and the latest devices for granted, numerous rural, indigenous, and economically disadvantaged communities around the world still lack reliable connectivity, or the financial means to participate fully in this digital revolution. This creates a dangerous paradox. The very technology designed to preserve marginalized histories could end up further marginalizing those without the resources to use it. If a community cannot afford the equipment or lacks the broadband infrastructure to upload its stories to a digital archive, those narratives risk being absent from the historical record of the future. This means that the digital age, for all its wonders, could potentially exacerbate existing inequalities, creating a future archive that is skewed toward the stories of the technologically connected and financially secure. Yet, despite these significant challenges, the overarching narrative of oral history in the digital age is one of incredible hope and resilience. Technology is being actively adapted and harnessed by communities to serve their specific needs for cultural preservation. Innovative projects are underway to create low-bandwidth, community-controlled digital archives that respect Indigenous protocols about what knowledge can be shared and with whom. Linguists are using digital recording to document endangered languages with a precision never before possible, creating invaluable resources for language revitalization. The digital realm has also given birth to new forms of storytelling that blend the ancient with the ultra-modern, such as interactive websites where users can navigate a map and listen to the stories tied to specific locations, or virtual reality experiences that allow someone to sit in a virtual room with a Holocaust survivor and feel the profound intimacy of their testimony. This dynamic evolution proves that the core purpose of oral history, to connect us to our past, to each other, and to our shared humanity, remains constant. The mediums may change from the spoken word around a fire to the digital file on a server, but the essential human impulse to tell our story and to be remembered endures, now amplified by tools that allow those stories to travel further and last longer than our ancestors could have ever dreamed. But what is it about the very act of storytelling that makes it such a uniquely powerful vehicle for memory, capable of carrying the weight of centuries on the rhythm of a well-told tale? The answer lies deep within the architecture of the human brain itself. We are not wired to remember lists of facts and figures with any great reliability. Our minds are not spreadsheets or databases. Instead, we are fundamentally narrative creatures. Our consciousness, our very sense of self, is structured as an ongoing story we tell ourselves about who we are. It is this innate psychological framework that oral histories tap into with such breathtaking efficiency, transforming abstract events into lived experiences that are not just learned, but felt and remembered on a cellular level. When we hear a dry recitation of facts, dates, names, statistical outcomes, our brains engage in a relatively straightforward process of data encoding, primarily utilizing regions like the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. This information is stored, but often in a fragile and easily forgotten way. Now, contrast that with the experience of listening to a compelling story. A skilled narrator doesn't just tell you that a long-fought battle was difficult. They describe the biting cold that numbed the soldier's fingers, the deafening roar of cannon fire that shook the ground, the desperate look in a young recruit's eyes as he clutched a letter from home. This rich sensory detail triggers a spectacular symphony of neural activity. The auditory cortex processes the words, the visual cortex lights up as we picture the scene, the motor cortex might even flicker as we unconsciously imagine the physical actions described. Most importantly, when a story evokes emotion, fear, joy, sadness, hope, it stimulates the amygdala and releases neurotransmitters like dopamine and cortisol, which act as chemical markers, essentially telling the brain, this is important. Remember this multi-sensory, emotional engagement is the secret. It creates a dense, interconnected web of neural pathways for the information, making it incredibly durable and far easier to retrieve later. The story structure itself provides a natural scaffold for memory. We remember the sequence of events, the beginning, the conflict, the resolution, because it mirrors the way we naturally process our own lives. A list of 10 historical events is a jumble of data. A story connecting those same 10 events into a cause and effect narrative about a family's journey across a continent becomes an unforgettable epic. This is why you might struggle to recall the specific year of a historical event from a textbook, but you can remember every detail of a captivating story your grandparent told you decades ago. The facts are embedded within the narrative, and the narrative is what sticks. This neurological superpower translates directly into the formation of identity. A story of ancestral survival during a famine or a great migration does more than just inform a listener about the past. It provides a psychological blueprint for resilience. When a community collectively remembers through story how their forebears endured unimaginable hardship through perseverance, ingenuity, and mutual support, that narrative becomes a source of strength for facing present-day challenges. It whispers to each new generation, "You come from a people who have overcome, therefore you too have this strength within you." This isn't just metaphorical, it's a concrete psychological resource. Knowing you are part of a larger story of survival can foster a profound sense of self-efficacy and hope, directly influencing how a community perceives its own capabilities and its future. This profound emotional connection is what ultimately forges the critical link between individual experience and the vast, abstract concept of collective memory. An individual's private memory is just a single point of light, but when that personal experience is shared as a story, and that story is heard, validated, and retold by others in the community, it connects to their points of light. Slowly, a constellation begins to form in the shared mental sky of the group. This constellation is collective memory, a shared understanding of the past built from countless individual stories that have been woven together into a common narrative. The psychological power of storytelling is the force that binds those individual points together, creating a shared identity that is greater than the sum of its parts. It explains why a nation can be moved to tears by a story of sacrifice, or inspired to unity by a tale of historic cooperation. The story bypasses our intellectual defenses and speaks directly to the emotional core of what it means to be human, ensuring that the most vital lessons of the past are not just remembered intellectually, but are felt viscerally, generation after generation. Imagine walking into a history classroom and instead of being handed a heavy textbook, you're given a pair of headphones. You press play, and suddenly you're not just learning about the civil rights movement. You're listening to the trembling yet determined voice of a young activist who sat at a segregated lunch counter, describing the fear and the resolve they felt as angry crowds jeered at them. This is the transformative power of bringing oral histories into education. It's a shift from learning about history to actually feeling history, from memorizing dates to understanding the human heartbeat behind those dates. Educational institutions at every level are increasingly recognizing that to truly engage students with the past, we must move beyond the dry, top-down narratives of traditional textbooks and invite in the raw, personal, and often overlooked voices that lived it. This isn't just an add-on to the curriculum. It's a fundamental reimagining of how we connect young people to the tapestry of human experience, making the study of history a deeply personal and emotionally resonant journey. The magic of this approach lies in its ability to foster genuine empathy and critical thinking simultaneously. A textbook chapter on the Holocaust might provide the staggering statistics: the 6 million Jews murdered, the timelines of the war, the mechanics of the camps. This information is essential, but it can also feel overwhelming and distant, a horror of such scale that it becomes almost abstract for a student. Now, introduce the oral testimony of a survivor like Eli Wiesel, or a lesser-known individual recorded in the archives of the USC Show Foundation. Their story narrows that immense lens to a single, piercing point of light. The student hears the crack in a voice when describing a last goodbye to a parent, the detailed memory of the bitter cold in the barracks, the small act of kindness that offered a glimmer of hope in utter darkness. This intimate connection does something a statistic never can. It makes the student care. That emotional investment is the engine of deep, lasting learning. It transforms the Holocaust from a historical event into a profound human tragedy, ensuring its lessons are felt rather than just forgotten after a test. Furthermore, this method naturally cultivates critical thinking skills. When students are presented with both a traditional written account, perhaps a government document or a general textbook summary, and a personal oral testimony from the same era, they are invited into the historian's workshop. They begin to ask essential questions. How do these accounts complement each other? Where do they differ? Why might a personal testimony include details about emotion and sensory experience that an official report omits? Conversely, why might the official document provide a broader strategic overview that an individual participant wouldn't have access to? This comparative analysis teaches students that history is not a single, settled story, but a collection of perspectives that must be weighed, evaluated, and synthesized to approach a fuller truth. They learn to be detectives of the past, questioning sources, understanding bias, and appreciating the complexity of constructing a narrative from multiple, sometimes contradictory, pieces of evidence. This leads directly to the third, and perhaps most vital, benefit: promoting inclusivity and challenging the single story. For far too long, history curricula have been dominated by the perspectives of the powerful, the politicians, the generals, the industrialists. The experiences of everyday people, of marginalized communities, of women, and of minority groups were often relegated to footnotes or omitted entirely. Oral history is the most powerful tool available to correct this imbalance. It provides a platform for what the renowned historian Howard Zinn called the people's history. Projects like the Zinn Education Project actively provide resources for teachers to center these voices, using oral testimonies to tell the history of the United States from the bottom up. Students learn about the struggle for labor rights not just from a chapter on unionization, but from the audio recordings of factory workers describing the brutal conditions they endured. They understand the civil rights movement through the voices of local organizers and young foot soldiers, not just through the speeches of Dr. King. This approach doesn't replace the traditional narrative. It enriches it, complicating our understanding of the past and ensuring that history is a story of, by, and for all people, not just a select few. It allows every student to see someone like themselves in the historical record, validating their own family's stories and their community's place in the grand sweep of time. Of course, integrating these powerful narratives into a classroom is not without its significant challenges, demanding careful and thoughtful navigation from educators. One of the foremost concerns is the verification of accuracy. Memory is fallible, and a personal testimony, while emotionally true, might contain chronological errors or conflate different events over time. This is not a reason to discard the source, but rather a teachable moment. Educators must guide students to cross-reference oral accounts with other primary and secondary sources, treating discrepancies not as failures but as fascinating historical puzzles to be solved. It's an opportunity to discuss how memory works, how trauma can affect recall, and how personal perspective shapes our interpretation of events. Another profound challenge involves handling sensitive and traumatic content. Many oral histories, especially those dealing with events like genocide, war, or systemic racism, contain graphic and deeply disturbing material. Teachers have a serious ethical responsibility to prepare students for this content, provide proper context, and create a supportive classroom environment where students can process their emotional responses. This often requires trigger warnings, robust follow-up discussions, and access to counseling resources, ensuring that the pursuit of historical empathy does not come at the cost of a student's emotional well-being. When these challenges are met with skill and sensitivity, the outcome is nothing short of empowering. Students emerge not as passive recipients of a pre-packaged past, but as active participants in the ongoing creation of collective memory. They learn that history is not a closed book but an open conversation, one that they have a right to join. They begin to appreciate the immense complexity of the human experience, understanding that there is rarely one simple reason for any historical event and that multiple truths can coexist. Most importantly, they start to see their own role in this process. An oral history education often culminates in students becoming creators themselves, going out into their own communities to interview family members, local veterans, or community elders. In doing so, they are no longer just learning about history. They are actively doing history, preserving the stories of their own time and place, and in the process, discovering that they too are part of the endless, evolving story of us. This practical application moves oral tradition from an abstract concept to a living practice, proving its undeniable value not just in understanding our world, but in shaping a more thoughtful, empathetic, and engaged generation to lead it. This profound responsibility of handling someone's life story brings us to a critical crossroads, one defined not by technical skill, but by a deep and unwavering ethical commitment. When we press record on a device to capture an oral history, we are not just collecting data, we are being entrusted with a piece of a person's soul, a fragment of their identity, and often a community's most sacred treasures. The power dynamic in this exchange is immense and cannot be ignored. The interviewer, often representing an institution, a university, or a media project, holds a position of perceived authority. The narrator, the storyteller, is in a vulnerable position, sharing personal, sometimes painful, memories. This imbalance makes ethical considerations the absolute bedrock of any authentic oral history practice. It's about moving from an act of extraction to an act of collaboration, ensuring that the process honors the storyteller not just as a source, but as a respected partner. At the very heart of this ethical framework is the principle of informed consent. This concept goes far beyond simply having someone sign a release form. True informed consent is an ongoing, transparent conversation that begins before the recorder is ever switched on and continues long after the interview is over. It means sitting down with the narrator and explaining, in clear and accessible language, exactly how their story might be used. Will it be archived in a university library for researchers? Could it be edited into a podcast or a documentary that reaches a global audience? Might their name and image be publicly associated with deeply personal trauma? They have a fundamental right to know all of this upfront and to have the power to say no to any use they are uncomfortable with. This also means they must retain the right to withdraw their consent later, even after the interview is completed. People's feelings about their own past can evolve, and a story they were willing to share one year might feel too private the next. Respecting this autonomy is non-negotiable. It is about affirming that the narrator, not the researcher, is the true owner of their narrative. Closely tied to consent is the sacred duty to protect the narrator's privacy and dignity. Some of the most powerful and historically valuable testimonies come from people sharing experiences of immense trauma, injustice, or personal struggle. The interviewer has a moral obligation to handle these stories with the utmost care, to avoid re-traumatizing the speaker during the interview itself, and to be hyper-vigilant about how these vulnerable details are later presented to the world. This might involve using a pseudonym instead of their real name, blurring their face in a video, or altering specific identifying details to protect them and their family from potential harm or stigma. The goal is never to sensationalize pain for the sake of a compelling narrative. The goal is to share truth while fiercely guarding the humanity and well-being of the person who was brave enough to share it. This respectful approach ensures that the process of documenting history does not inadvertently perpetuate new harms. The risk of misrepresentation and exploitation is a constant shadow in this work. Once a story is recorded and enters an archive, it can be taken out of its original context, edited in a way that changes its meaning, or used for a purpose the narrator never intended. Imagine a story about a community's resistance to pollution being edited to seem like it's an endorsement of the very corporation responsible. Or consider a spiritual narrative from an indigenous elder being stripped of its sacred context and presented in a museum as a simple folktale for entertainment. This is a profound form of theft, divorcing knowledge from its cultural and personal roots. To combat this, many indigenous communities are leading the way by establishing their own rigorous protocols for engagement. They insist that researchers enter into formal agreements, ensuring that the community retains copyright and control over how their stories are used, who can access them, and for what purpose. They may designate certain stories as sacred and not for public consumption, to be preserved only for future generations within the community itself. This asserts that their oral traditions are not free for the taking, they are protected cultural property. This shifts the entire paradigm from one of extraction to one of collaboration. The most ethical oral history projects are those where the community are active partners from the very beginning. They are involved in designing the project's questions, identifying the important themes to explore, and even training the interviewers to ensure cultural competence. The process doesn't end when the recording stops. Community members should be invited to participate in transcribing, translating, and annotating the interviews to ensure their accuracy and context are preserved. The final products, whether they are books, exhibits, or digital archives, should be shared with and approved by the community before they are released to the wider world. This collaborative model acknowledges that the researcher is not an objective, neutral observer but a guest in someone else's historical landscape. It redistributes power, ensuring that the process benefits the community itself, helping them to strengthen their own cultural revitalization efforts and control their own narrative destiny. Ultimately, navigating this complex ethical terrain is about one simple, profound thing: honoring the trust that has been placed in us. A person who shares their story is offering a gift of immense value and vulnerability. Handling that gift with respect, humility, and a commitment to justice is what transforms oral history from a mere academic exercise into a genuine practice of healing, reconciliation, and mutual understanding. It ensures that these powerful voices from the past and present are not just preserved, but are honored in the way they are preserved, allowing their truths to resonate with integrity for generations to come. While official records might show the statistics of inequality, the disparity in sentencing, the number of lynchings, the unemployment rates, they often fail to capture the chilling fear of a knock on the door in the middle of the night, the searing humiliation of being forced to use a separate water fountain, or the quiet, determined courage of a mother preparing her child for a world she knows. Unjust. This is the profound void that oral histories fill in the pursuit of social justice. They move the struggle from the abstract to the achingly personal, providing incontrovertible evidence of injustice not through cold data, but through the raw, unfiltered testimony of lived experience. When a person shares their story of discrimination, of violence, of systemic neglect, it ceases to be a political issue and becomes a human one. This emotional resonance is what has the power to dismantle apathy, to prick the conscience of a nation, and to mobilize public opinion in a way that 1,000 reports simply cannot. Oral histories become the moral compass for social movements, grounding their demands for change in the undeniable reality of individual suffering and resilience. We can see this powerful dynamic at work in the very heart of the American civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, while we rightly remember the iconic speeches of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the landmark legislation that was passed. The true engine of that movement was fueled by the countless oral testimonies of ordinary people performing extraordinary acts of bravery. Projects like the one undertaken by activist and archivist Septima Clark, who traveled across the South teaching literacy and citizenship, involved recording the stories of sharecroppers, domestic workers, and students. These narratives documented the grassroots organizing, the personal sacrifices, and the brutal reprisals that never made it into the newspapers. Hearing a woman describe in her own words the terror of a cross burning on her lawn, or a young man recount the determination he felt facing down a police dog, does something a textbook cannot. It captures the tremor in their voice, the long pause as they gather themselves to recall a painful memory. These are the human details that build empathy and forge an unbreakable connection between the listener and the speaker. These stories were shared at church meetings, around kitchen tables, and eventually with the world, serving to inspire continued activism by showing that the fight was not being waged by distant leaders, but by neighbors, friends, and family members whose names deserved to be remembered. This tradition of using personal narrative to challenge power and demand accountability has found a powerful new expression in the digital age with movements like Me Too. What began as a hashtag quickly evolved into a global outcry, built almost entirely on the foundation of oral testimony. Survivors of sexual harassment and assault, often silenced by fear, shame, and non-disclosure agreements, used the relative anonymity and reach of social media to share their stories. This created a devastating chorus of lived experience that could no longer be ignored or dismissed as isolated incidents. The collective weight of these millions of voices revealed a pervasive pattern of systemic abuse across industries, from Hollywood to hospitality, fundamentally shifting the public conversation. It forced a long overdue reckoning, toppling powerful figures and leading to tangible policy changes in workplaces and legislatures around the world. The Me Too movement is a quintessential example of how oral history, when amplified by modern technology, can bypass traditional gatekeepers of media and justice to create a people's tribunal, where the sheer volume of shared truth becomes an irrefutable demand for change. Beyond mobilizing the public, one of the most critical functions of these narratives is their power to validate and heal. For victims of trauma and injustice, being silenced is a second injury. When an institution or a society refuses to acknowledge your pain, it compounds the suffering, making you question your own reality and experience. The act of telling your story in a supportive environment and having it be believed and witnessed is a profoundly validating and therapeutic act. It represents a reclaiming of agency. Oral history projects dedicated to collecting testimonies from marginalized groups, be they refugees, survivors of police brutality, or indigenous peoples dispossessed of their land, perform this essential service. They create a formal space for acknowledgement, affirming that what happened to you was real, it was wrong, and it matters. This process fosters immense solidarity among those who have shared similar experiences, breaking down the isolating walls of shame and building communities of support and shared purpose. This solidarity, born from shared story, is the bedrock upon which lasting social movements are built, transforming individual pain into collective power. Ultimately, the role of oral history in social justice is to democratize memory itself. It wrests control of the historical narrative away from the powerful and places it back into the hands of the people. It ensures that the archive of our time is not solely written by the winners, but is richly detailed with the perspectives of those who struggled, resisted, and endured. By insisting that these lived experiences are not merely anecdotal but are essential historical evidence, oral histories force a more inclusive and accurate accounting of our past. This, in turn, reshapes our national consciousness, creating a collective memory that is honest enough to acknowledge its failures and courageous enough to be guided by them. These stories become a permanent part of our moral landscape, a testament to the enduring human spirit, and a powerful catalyst for a more just and equitable future, reminding us that the pursuit of justice begins with the simple, radical act of listening. The vibrant pulse of oral tradition has always found a natural home in the expressive realms of art and literature, providing a deep well of inspiration that transcends mere subject matter to become the very structural backbone of creative works. This is not a simple act of borrowing a plot or a character. It is a profound fusion where the spirit, rhythm, and communal essence of oral storytelling are woven into the fabric of the art itself, creating pieces that don't just tell a story but that feel like a story being told, live and breathing right before you. This artistic alchemy transforms intimate, spoken narratives into powerful cultural monuments that can define and reshape a people's understanding of themselves, especially for communities grappling with the legacy of colonialism and the erosion of their own historical voices. The creative synergy between a whispered history and a published novel, a folk tune and a symphony, is a testament to the enduring need to translate memory into something tangible, beautiful, and enduring. In the world of literature, few authors exemplify this transformative power more completely than the Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe. His landmark work, Things Fall Apart, is far more than a story about pre-colonial Igbo society. It is a masterful embodiment of its oral traditions. Achebe doesn't just write about proverbs, he saturates his prose with them, understanding that in his culture, proverbs are the palm oil with which words are eaten. They are the essential vehicle for wisdom, diplomacy, and social cohesion. The novel's structure itself mirrors the cadence of oral performance, with its deliberate pacing, its incorporation of folktales within the main narrative, and its deep respect for the complex social and spiritual systems that were passed down through generations by word of mouth. Achebe was writing directly against the grain of colonial literature, which had depicted Africa as a silent, savage void waiting for European illumination. By channeling the oral histories of his people into the form of the European novel, he performed a revolutionary act. He gave his ancestors a voice on the global literary stage, asserting the richness and sophistication of a culture that had been systematically denied its own history. He didn't just write a story, he installed an entire world's way of speaking and remembering into the canon of world literature, forever changing it. Across the Atlantic, the Colombian magician of words, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, achieved a similar, though stylistically distinct, feat. His masterpiece, 100 Years of Solitude, is the pinnacle of the literary style known as magical realism, a mode that is deeply indebted to the oral storytelling culture of the Caribbean coast where he was raised. The novel's famous opening line, many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice, is a classic oral storyteller's hook, immediately bending time and promising a vast, interconnected saga. The book reads as if it is being recounted by an omniscient village elder, someone who knows every family secret, every supernatural occurrence, and every historical tragedy, blending the miraculous with the mundane as a matter of course. This is not a literary gimmick. It is a direct reflection of a world shaped by oral narratives where ghosts are as real as neighbors, and where history is not a linear sequence of events but a cyclical, repeating pattern of myths and lessons. Garcia Marquez didn't invent this tone. He absorbed it from the stories he heard growing up and translated that oral, communal voice into a literary form that captivated the world, proving that the specific folk traditions of a region could produce universal and timeless art. This profound influence extends far beyond the written page, deeply infusing the world of music with historical weight and cultural purpose. For centuries, music has served as one of the most powerful and portable vessels for oral history. Protest songs and anthems from movements for civil rights, labor rights, and independence struggles are essentially oral histories set to melody, designed to be easily memorized and sung by crowds, thus uniting people in a shared story and a common cause. The folk music traditions of every culture are repositories of collective memory. Irish ballads mourn the hardships of the famine and the longing of emigration, while the corridos of Mexico narrate tales of revolutionary heroes, tragic love, and social injustice, functioning as singing newspapers for communities. In the United States, the blues emerged directly from the oral traditions of enslaved Africans. Its call and response structure and lyrical themes of struggle and resilience forming a raw, musical chronicle of Black experience in America. These musical forms do more than preserve a record. They encode emotion, allowing the pain, joy, and defiance of the past to be felt directly by listeners decades or even centuries later, ensuring that the emotional truth of history never fades. Visual artists, too, have long turned to oral histories as a source of potent thematic material, creating works that give physical form to collective memory. Installations, sculptures, and paintings often serve as visual anchors for stories that might otherwise remain intangible. Renowned contemporary artist Kara Walker's massive silhouette installations, for instance, draw upon the unspoken and horrific oral histories of slavery, creating haunting tableaux that force viewers to confront the brutal and complex narratives that official histories often sanitize. Her work is a direct engagement with the stories that have been passed down, the secrets kept, and the trauma embedded in the collective memory of the African American experience. Similarly, many Indigenous artists use traditional symbols, patterns, and motifs learned through oral teaching to create modern artworks that assert the continuity and vitality of their cultures. A painting might illustrate a dreamtime story, a tapestry might weave together a creation myth, or a sculpture might depict a legendary ancestor. These works are more than decoration, they are declarations of presence. They are a way of saying, we are still here, and these stories which you tried to erase are now visible and permanent. This artistic engagement ensures that oral histories are not locked in the past but are continually reinterpreted, recontextualized, and made relevant for new audiences, allowing each generation to find its own connection to the ancient and ongoing narrative. Yet for all their resilience, the very act of passing down history through speech and memory is inherently fragile, facing a constellation of challenges that threaten to silence these voices forever. The most immediate and personal of these hurdles is the fallibility of human memory itself. Unlike a document locked away in an archive, an oral history lives and breathes in the mind of the storyteller. With each retelling, subtle shifts can occur. A date might be ECOME Chinese letter, a minor character might be forgotten, or a detail might be unconsciously emphasized to better suit the concerns of the present day. This isn't a sign of dishonesty, it's simply how our brains work. We reconstruct memories each time we access them, and in that process, they can be influenced by subsequent experiences, by the reactions of our audience, or by our own desire to find meaning in past events. This natural evolution is part of what gives oral history its dynamic, living quality, but it also introduces the risk of cumulative distortion over generations, where the story that is told a century later may carry only a faint echo of the original event, its historical accuracy softened by the countless tellings in between. Compounding this is the silent crisis of language extinction, which acts like a key being thrown away for an entire library of stories. It's estimated that a language dies somewhere in the world every 2 weeks, and with it vanishes a unique way of perceiving the world. Many oral histories are so deeply entwined with the specific words, tones, and grammatical structures of their original language that they become untranslatable without significant loss. A concept perfectly captured in a single word in one tongue might require a clumsy, paragraph-long explanation in another, draining the story of its rhythm, its humor, and its deeper cultural meanings. When the last fluent speaker of a language passes away, it's not just vocabulary that is lost. It's an entire universe of stories, jokes, prayers, and knowledge that simply ceases to exist. The oral histories encoded in that language become like songs for which we have only the lyrics but have forever lost the melody, their true essence and emotional power fading into silence. This loss is accelerated by the relentless forces of globalization and urbanization, which can dissolve the very communities that serve as the custodians of these traditions. When young people leave rural villages for opportunities in distant cities, they often become disconnected from the elder knowledge keepers. The intimate settings for storytelling, the evening gatherings, the seasonal festivals, the communal work where stories were naturally shared begin to vanish. In the busy, fragmented modern world, there is often little time or space for the slow, patient art of oral transmission. The community's collective memory, once a shared resource maintained by all, can succumb to a kind of cultural amnesia, where the stories are no longer told simply because the context for telling them has disappeared. The threads connecting the generations grow thin and can eventually snap. In response to these threats, technology has emerged as a powerful, if double-edged, tool for preservation. Digital recorders, video cameras, and cloud storage offer the tantalizing promise of capturing these narratives with perfect fidelity, creating a permanent record safe from the vagaries of memory and time. Initiatives large and small are dedicated to creating digital archives of endangered languages and stories. However, this technological solution brings its own set of challenges. The equipment, software, and stable internet access required for high-quality digital preservation are often out of reach for the very communities most at risk of losing their heritage. The expertise needed to curate metadata and maintain a digital archive over the long term is a specialized skill set. Furthermore, there is a philosophical tension in this process. By freezing a story in a digital recording, are we preserving it, or are we essentially placing it in a museum case, removing it from the living, evolving tradition that gives it meaning? An overly rigid approach to documentation, focused solely on capturing one authentic version, might inadvertently stifle the dynamic nature of oral history, preventing it from adapting and remaining relevant to future generations. This highlights the central, delicate balancing act at the heart of preservation: how to safeguard the core essence and integrity of a narrative while still allowing it the freedom to breathe, grow, and resonate with new audiences. It is not about finding a single, perfect solution, but about fostering collaborative, respectful partnerships. This means scholars and institutions must work not as outside experts extracting data, but as humble partners providing resources and technical skills at the direction of the community itself. It involves supporting programs that train new generations of storytellers within the community, empowering them to become the next link in the chain. It means developing accessible, community-controlled digital archives that respect cultural protocols about which stories can be shared widely and which must remain within the community. Ultimately, protecting these invaluable narratives requires a multifaceted approach that honors both the past and the future, ensuring that the whispers of our ancestors are not saved as mere echoes in a database, but are kept alive as living, breathing conversations that continue to guide and define us. Think about the last national holiday you experienced: the flags, the parades, the solemn speeches. These events feel timeless, as if they've always been a part of the national fabric. But where do these powerful rituals and shared emotions actually come from? Often, their roots are not found in official state documents, but in the deeply personal, human stories that have been passed down through families and communities, the very essence of oral history. National holidays and days of commemoration serve as a formal stage where these intimate, spoken narratives are elevated into the grand theater of public memory. They transform individual grief, pride, or sacrifice into a collective experience, using the emotional power of oral testimony to create a sense of shared identity and purpose that can bind an entire nation together. It is on these designated days that the whispers of the past are amplified into a chorus that everyone is invited to join. Consider the profound solemnity of Memorial Day in the United States. While it is marked by official ceremonies and the laying of wreaths, its true emotional weight is carried by the personal stories shared by veterans and Gold Star families. A speech from a soldier recounting the specific, harrowing details of a battle, the name of a fallen comrade, the sound of incoming fire, the promise made to a dying friend, does something no historical summary ever could. It translates the abstract concept of sacrifice for one's country into a visceral human experience that listeners can feel in their bones. Similarly, in Australia and New Zealand, Anzac Day is built upon a foundation of oral histories from the Gallipoli campaign in World War I. The legend of the Anzac spirit of endurance, courage, and mateship in the face of horrific conditions was not born in a government report. It was forged in the letters sent home by diggers, in the anecdotes told by survivors to their children, and in the poems that captured the public's imagination. These personal narratives, repeated year after year at dawn services and community gatherings, have become the sacred texts of a national identity, teaching each new generation what it means to be an Australian or a New Zealander through the powerful medium of lived experience. This process of weaving oral history into public ritual is incredibly effective for fostering national unity. By providing a shared story and a common emotional experience, these commemorations create a powerful sense of belonging. They say, in effect, this is our story, this pain is our pain, this pride is our pride. They connect strangers across vast distances through a shared narrative, creating an imagined community that feels real because its members collectively remember the same events in the same way. The stories told become a kind of civic glue, reinforcing the values a nation wishes to uphold, whether it's resilience, freedom, or the importance of never forgetting. However, this very power to unify also contains a potential danger: the power to simplify and exclude. the official narrative promoted on a national holiday is often a curated, sanitized version of history, one designed to inspire patriotic feeling rather than to confront complex or uncomfortable truths. The oral histories that are amplified are typically those that fit neatly into this uplifting national myth, while stories that challenge or complicate the narrative are often left out of the official ceremonies. For instance, Memorial Day and the 4th of July in the U.S. often center on a unifying narrative of freedom and sacrifice, but they frequently sidestep the oral histories that speak to a more complicated legacy, the experiences of African American soldiers who fought for liberties abroad that they were denied at home, or the perspectives of Native American communities for whom national expansion meant dispossession. This selective use of memory can create a distorted, one-dimensional view of the past, airbrushing the national self-portrait to hide its blemishes and contradictions. This is why a critical examination of these commemorations is so vital. We must ask not only what stories are being told on these days, but also whose stories are being left untold. The process of institutionalizing oral history into national practice is never neutral. It is a political act that shapes how a society understands itself and its place in the world. By choosing to highlight certain narratives and silence others, these holidays actively shape patriotic sentiment, often directing it toward uncritical pride rather than thoughtful reflection. A mature and healthy national identity, however, has the capacity to hold space for a more complete and honest memory. It can make room on the podium for the veteran who speaks of heroic sacrifice, but also for the war correspondent who shares stories of civilian suffering, or the anti-war protester who recounts their moral struggle. This doesn't diminish the day, it enriches it, transforming a simple patriotic ritual into a more profound, nuanced, and ultimately more respectful act of remembrance. It acknowledges that a nation's history is not a single thread but a tangled, multicolored tapestry, and that true honor lies in acknowledging the entirety of the picture, not just the most flattering parts. This intersection of oral history and national practice shows us that how we choose to remember is just as important as what we choose to remember, forever influencing the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. So what does the path ahead look like for these ancient yet ever-evolving traditions? The future of oral history is not a question of whether it will survive, but how it will transform, adapting to a world of dizzying technological change and deepening global interconnection. We're standing at the precipice of a new era, one where the intimate act of storytelling could be revolutionized by tools like artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and digital archiving on a scale previously unimaginable. Imagine not just listening to a survivor's testimony, but through a virtual reality headset, sitting across from a holographic representation of them, able to look into their eyes and feel the palpable weight of their presence as they share their story. Artificial intelligence could be used to transcribe and translate interviews in real time, breaking down language barriers instantly, or even to analyze thousands of oral histories to identify patterns and connections that a human researcher might miss over a lifetime of study. Digital storytelling platforms will allow for interactive narratives where a user could choose to explore different facets of a community's history, following the threads that interest them most through a rich tapestry of interconnected voices. These advancements promise to make these narratives more immersive, more accessible to a global audience, and more securely preserved for centuries to come than ever before. Yet with these breathtaking opportunities come significant perils that we must navigate with great care and intention. The very technology that can amplify a voice also has the power to distort it. There's a real risk of homogenization where the unique cadence, the regional dialect, the emotional nuance of a story told in its original language is flattened out by auto-translation or edited for a mass global audience, sanding away its distinctive edges. The immersive power of virtual reality is incredible, but if used irresponsibly, it could veer into sensationalism or even trauma tourism, turning someone's deeply personal lived experience into a form of entertainment. And as we rely more on algorithms to catalog and suggest stories, we must ask who is programming those algorithms and what biases might be baked into them. Will they prioritize certain narratives over others, creating a new, digital form of the same gatekeeping that oral history has traditionally fought against? The greatest challenge will be to harness these powerful new tools without sacrificing the authenticity, the humanity, and the essential truth that lies at the heart of every spoken testimony. This isn't about using technology for its own sake. It's about ensuring that technology serves the story and the storyteller, not the other way around. This imperative will likely shape the central missions of oral history in the coming decades. A major focus will be on radical democratization, actively working to shatter the remaining barriers that prevent marginalized voices from being heard. This means not only collecting more stories from more diverse communities, but also empowering those communities to tell their own stories on their own terms. We'll see a rise in participatory projects that provide the tools and training for people to document their own histories, shifting the role of the institutional historian from an interviewer to a facilitator and collaborator. Furthermore, the immense global challenges we face, particularly the climate crisis, are driving a new appreciation for the practical wisdom embedded within oral traditions. Indigenous knowledge systems passed down orally for millennia contain incredibly detailed observations about ecosystem management, weather patterns, and sustainable living that are suddenly critically relevant to modern scientists and policymakers. The future will see increased efforts to bridge these ways of knowing, to bring the oral histories of elders who have lived in harmony with their environment for generations into conversation with satellite data and climate models, creating a more holistic and effective approach to environmental stewardship. This is not a hypothetical future, it's already unfolding. Around the world, we are witnessing a powerful revitalization movement, particularly within Indigenous communities who are reclaiming their narrative sovereignty. They are using digital tools to create their own archives on their own protocols, ensuring that their languages and stories are preserved in a way that respects their cultural values. Young people are being trained in traditional storytelling methods, not as a relic of the past, but as a dynamic skill for the future. This global shift signals a growing and long overdue recognition that oral histories are not a quaint alternative to written history, but are indispensable, robust knowledge systems in their own right. They offer ways of understanding time, relationship, and responsibility that the modern world desperately needs. As we move forward, these spoken narratives will remain our most vital tools for understanding the complex tapestry of our shared past and for weaving a more inclusive, resilient, and empathetic future. This forward-looking perspective invites all of us to become active participants in this story, to consider how we can listen more deeply, support the communities preserving their heritage, and perhaps most importantly, to ensure that our own stories are added to the great, ongoing conversation that defines us. The beautiful thing is that you don't need to be a professional historian or have any special equipment to become a guardian of these living stories. The most powerful tool you already likely have in your pocket, your smartphone. Its ability to record high-quality audio and video makes it a perfect mobile archive, ready to capture a moment of reminiscence whenever it arises. The key is to move beyond just snapping photos at family gatherings and to intentionally create space for listening. Think of yourself not as an interviewer, but as a curious friend or a dedicated apprentice, there to receive a gift that only your loved one can give. The goal isn't to conduct a formal interrogation with a rigid list of questions, but to foster a natural, flowing conversation that invites reflection and personal meaning. Begin with the elders in your own life, your grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, or even older neighbors who have witnessed decades of change. Choose a comfortable, quiet setting free from distractions and frame your request with warmth and respect. You might say, "I've been thinking a lot about our family's history lately, and I would love to hear about your childhood someday." Or, "I admire your perspective on things, and I'd be so grateful if you'd share some of your memories with me." When you sit down to talk, use open-ended questions that encourage detailed narratives rather than simple yes or no answers. Instead of "Did you like school?" try "What are your most vivid memories of your school days? Who was your favorite teacher and why?" instead of "What was your first job?" Ask, "Can you walk me through a typical day at your first job? What did it teach you?" Questions that begin with "How did you feel when?" or "Tell me the story of how you met Grandpa." Unlock emotional and descriptive treasures that facts alone can never reveal. Once you've captured these stories, you become their steward. Make sure to safely back up the recordings, save them in multiple places, like a cloud drive and an external hard drive. Then consider the beautiful act of sharing them. You could create a private family YouTube channel or a shared digital album where relatives across the country can access and enjoy them. For those looking to contribute to a wider historical record, platforms like StoryCorps offer a magnificent framework. Their app provides question prompts and even allows you to upload your recording directly to the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, ensuring your family's narrative becomes part of the nation's memory. Local historical societies, libraries, and museums are also often eager to receive copies of oral histories that document life in their community, preserving the unique character of your town or region for future researchers and residents. Your engagement can extend far beyond your own family tree. Look for community-based oral history projects in your area that might be documenting specific experiences, such as the lives of local veterans, the history of a particular industry, or the stories of a cultural neighborhood. Volunteering your time to help with these efforts is an incredible way to learn and contribute. Furthermore, supporting organizations dedicated to this work is crucial. This could mean donating to institutions like the Smithsonian or your local museum, advocating for the inclusion of oral history projects in school curricula, or simply attending public storytelling events and listening with an open heart. Every time you choose to listen deeply, to record a memory, or to support an archive, you are casting a vote for a more inclusive, empathetic, and richly detailed understanding of our shared past. You are transforming from a passive consumer of history into an active participant in its creation, ensuring that the chorus of voices that defines us only grows louder, more diverse, and more resilient with each passing generation. And so we reach the end of our journey, but for oral history itself, there is no end. It is a continuous, unbroken thread, a living conversation that stretches from the deepest past into the far future. We've seen how these spoken narratives are so much more than simple tales. They are the very lifeblood of our collective existence. They guard the unique flavors of cultural heritage that might otherwise be lost to time, ensuring that a language, a recipe, a sacred dance, or a way of understanding the world is not forgotten. They stand as courageous counter-narratives, challenging the single story often told by those in power and amplifying the voices of the marginalized, the oppressed, and the everyday people who truly shape history through their lived experiences. And perhaps most beautifully, They are the vessels that carry our core values, lessons of resilience, compassion, and community from one generation to the next, acting as both a moral compass and a guide for how to live together. From the ancient griots of West Africa to the digital storytellers of today, the methods may evolve, but the essential human need to share our story remains constant. These narratives adapt, ensuring their wisdom stays relevant, whether whispered around a fire or streamed across the globe. They offer us something that a written document alone cannot: the tremor in a voice recalling a loss, the laughter in a shared memory, the palpable emotion that connects us directly to the heart of an experience. This is the irreplaceable gift of oral history. It doesn't just inform us, it makes us feel, it builds empathy, and it forges an unbreakable bond between the listener and the speaker. This power, however, is not a spectator sport. It invites, it requires our participation. The responsibility to preserve these voices does not lie solely with archivists and academics. It rests with every single one of us. You hold immense power to contribute to this living archive. Begin with your own family. Record that conversation with your grandparent. Ask your parent about their first love or their biggest challenge. Document the story behind a cherished family heirloom or a faded photograph. In your community, seek out the local historians, the longtime residents, the keepers of your town's unique lore. Support the libraries, museums, and cultural organizations that work tirelessly to safeguard these narratives for everyone. By taking these actions, you do more than just preserve the past. You actively shape a richer, more honest, and more inclusive future. You ensure that the full, complex, and beautiful tapestry of human experience is remembered not as a monologue, but as a chorus of countless voices, each one essential to the song of who we are. Thank you for listening, for caring, and for becoming a part of this